Greetings everybody and welcome to one of our Flowgear bite-sized videos, the purpose of which is to get you, the integrator, up to speed with some of the very important features and concepts within the Flowgear platform. And on top of that, we'll be looking at one of our very common use cases. The very first thing we're going to want to do is to log into our Flowgear tenant. Now we will have provided you with a Flowgear tenant ID. You can see I've plugged mine in on the top here, and then you'll obviously provide the user against which you would like to authenticate. Once that's been done, you can go ahead and click on Next, and that's going to log you into the Flowgear console. Now, based on the user you provided, your role will determine what you can and can't do. So through role-based access, effectively, you'll be able to navigate to certain portions of the Flowgear console. Now, ultimately, each of these Flowgear tenants is deployed against its own VM, which is going to provide you with a maximum level of separation and security. Now, the primary purpose of the console is to provide you, the user, with a space in which you can seamlessly transition to the different elements of the platform that you may find yourself working with. How this is functionally done is through selecting any of the navigational elements of on the navigation bar on the left-hand side. Let's start at the bottom, and we can go through a handful of these. Starting with drop points. Drop points are a lightweight agent that you can install on-prem, which is going to facilitate a persistent outbound connection to the primary Flowgear environment. What this functionally means is, irrespective of where your primary Flowgear environment is hosted, you're going to be able to install this tool directly on another on-prem system and still be able to get data to and from your Flowgear environment and the system in which you've installed the tool against. Connections are a place to plug in credentials unique to a particular platform or product. So if we open up one of our connections, just as an example, Salesforce, you'll notice that we can plug in credentials that would serve to authenticate you with Salesforce. And we'll be specific around what we require within the naming of the particular properties. And you can also take a look at our help article, which is going to give you an idea of what each one does and how you could potentially acquire it. Now, you can effectively go and test against that as well using the test connection button. There we go. You will then note that you have in fact been able to connect to that environment. You'll also see that you can go and click on different environments here. Test UAT in production. Functionally, this allows you to plug in different sets of credentials for the different environments you may own or have access to. Now, you can customize this. You can have additional environments. You can change their names. You can remove some. Ultimately, we're not always aware of what your environment looks like in terms of lifecycle management, so you get to set it up according to what your current policy or procedure has been up until this point. It also plays a large role in how we do lifecycle management in general within Flowgear, and we'll get to that a bit later as well. Now let's take a look at workflow logs. This is a place in which we are able to store the transactional inputs and outputs of all the nodes that have executed within the platform. And you can see what those inputs and outputs are here. You can also redact that as well. So anything you do not want to be stored can be redacted and therefore will never be stored on the Flowgear platform. And functionally what this place does is it allows developers or anybody developing or maintaining these solutions to have a very good view of what has happened on the platform so that they could potentially debug and solve a problem should one arise. It's not going to fill the purpose of reporting to your end users or integration reporting in general. Those kinds of tasks whereby, as an example, you want to report a number of invoices processed, which of them failed and why they failed, that would be something that is built alongside the workflows themselves. Finally, we can take a look at workflows. Workflows are the design canvases on which we actually build these solutions. So here's where we then facilitate that drag and drop and low to no code design. And we're going to go ahead and open one up and give you a bit more detail around what that looks like. Let's go ahead and open up a brand new workflow. You can go ahead and do this by clicking on the new workflow button over here. We'll then have a randomly generated name, which of course you're welcome to change. And we can go ahead and confirm that on the bottom right. We're then greeted with a Flowgear design canvas, the primary purpose of which is to expose all of Flowgear's pre-built tooling so that you, the integrator, can drag and drop that onto the canvas and then build some kind of integration or automation, really to whatever level of complexity you require. Now, as I've said, there's a big emphasis on drag and drop, and there's an emphasis on low to no code based on your preference and the kind of tools you'd like to use. Now, how we can expose these tools to the canvas is by clicking on any of the plus icons you see popping up as I hover around. And we're then going to be greeted with these tools as a list of nodes. We call them nodes. They're best described as elements that can be dropped onto the design canvas that will then provide a particular integration process. So in other words, they're going to be doing something for you. Now, depending on what they're doing for you, we'll have them categorized into one of 4 distinct categories. The very first category is our connectors. They will effectively connect to the systems that we want to integrate and automate, and they do this by exposing as much of that vendor's API functionality as is possible, and exposing those actions at something called samples. That might not make a lot of sense right now, but you'll see exactly what that looks like a little bit later. We then have triggers. Triggers will determine the condition upon which a workflow executes. So in other words, it allows you to determine whether your workflow should execute once daily, based off of an email arriving in an inbox, a particular queue. There are a number of mechanisms to determine whether your workflow should kick off. Processes are going to work with data in memory with the intent to transform that data and prepare it for the next stage, whether that's one of many or the final stage of ingress. Effectively, what these nodes will do is ensure that you can enrich, supplement, transform, and validate the data to get it into the systems that you're actually attempting to integrate with. And finally, flow control gives you the ability to enable conditional branching on the canvas, and that conditional branching will form the high-level logic for things like error handling, business logic, any kind of decision making that the workflow has to actually make, even if that data has to be handled by a separate workflow or anything of that sort. Now, ultimately, it's a collection of all of these nodes that allow you to build these integrations to whatever level of complexity you require. Triggers are then going to facilitate the condition upon which the workflow executes. So it will determine whether your workflow should kick off twice daily, once an email arrives in a particular inbox, monitor a particular queue. There's a number of options for why a workflow would or wouldn't kick off. We then have processes, the primary purpose of which is to go ahead and work with the extracted data in memory with the intent to transform that data and prep it for the next step, whether that is one of many steps or the final step of ingress. Functionally, they will go ahead and transform, enrich, validate, and supplement those data sets so that you can move them across to the systems you want them to be in. Finally, we have flow control. Flow control nodes will allow you to enable conditional branching on the canvas, which forms a big portion of your high-level logic or decision making. This could be error handling. This could be determining whether a particular process has to be kicked off by a sub-workflow, whether an invoice has to be processed with a different kind of mapping. It is once again going to allow you to make a lot of the decisions that make up your production-ready workflow. It is, of course, a collection of all of these different categories that allow you to build these integrations and automations to whatever level of complexity you require. Enterprise API gives you the ability to turn any workflow into an API-bound endpoint. This means that through the typical design experience within Flowgear, you can go ahead and expose some of that functionality or data to a web endpoint, which can then be consumed by a third-party application or program that has the ability to do so. So here, in a very brief example, we're extracting information from SQL, we're mapping that into a JSON payload, and we're functionally exposing that to an endpoint that somebody can consume. And we can see how this is done by heading over to Settings, Workflow Settings, and we'll notice that we've applied a get binding to this workflow. We have our demo domain, of course, which should be customizable according to your tenant, and then we have the actual URL for test contacts. And should somebody have this URL and the appropriate access token, they can go ahead and extract a list of contacts from the database that we've hooked up within Flowgear. Revision management is a feature which allows you to inspect the design of a previous version of a workflow. You can do so by clicking on the revision history button over here. And then you can take a look at the different versions that had been saved in the past and open up any one of them. That provides you with the design of that workflow at the time that it was saved. You can then even revert to that version as the latest version by saving over the workflow, and you'll be expected to ensure that you are happy to do so by confirming with a yes for confirmation. Revision management is one of the many tools Flowgear exposes as part of our lifecycle management suite. Release management is another powerful feature within Flowgear's suite of lifecycle management tools. Release management works by preventing workflow design changes from immediately affecting production. This is done by enforcing the process of a user with the appropriate permissions promoting workflow design across the relevant environments until it is ready to be promoted into production. Let's take a look at how this is actually performed. So here we have a workflow which we're going to go ahead and save. We can provide a save or commit message over here. And then we'll receive confirmation of the workflow being saved through the green banner. At which point we can go ahead and open up the release management by clicking on this button over here. We will notice that this particular workflow has a version in test, but none in UAT or production yet. And so what we can do at this point is we can actually promote the workflow across to UAT. This will then allow us to execute the workflow in the UAT environment using the credentials that were provided in the connection under the UAT tab. And then once we're happy with that, we can go ahead and do the final portion by promoting this into production. Similarly to what I've just done. Now you're welcome to use the UI that Flowgear exposes to do this, but realistically what's happening in the back end is these particular designs are going to be stored as GitHub commits. And so you can actually see a text-based version of the workflow, which you can then compare against older versions. So while you're welcome to use it in the manner that I've just shown you, ideally you're able to forklift whatever your lifecycle management policy and procedure is into something like a GitHub environment and effectively run your pipelines and your commits and approvals as you've been doing up until now. It's time to take a look at another one of the connectors in our suite of generic connectors, the REST request, whose primary purpose it is to consume an OpenAPI definition and provide a very similar experience to what you're used to for our branded connectors. That is, you can go ahead and select a sample based off of the endpoints that the vendor exposes for the platform or product. What this functionally means is, should Flowgear not have already branded a Flowgear connector for a particular service or API, you can go ahead and consume that API's OpenAPI definition to provide you with the exact same functionality that you can expect from our branded connectors. Within this demo, we're primarily looking at the actual connector itself, the use of the connector, the setting up of the connection, and the surrounding concepts. We're not too concerned around what products we're actually connecting here, but more just how we can consume a generic REST-based API out there. Now, before we do anything on the canvas, I think it's important we discuss some of the effort around using something like the REST request so that you get an idea of the kind of tasks you have to accomplish outside of the actual workflow design. Now, whereas we generally take care of everything in terms of sourcing the API documentation and steering you in the right direction in terms of authentication on our branded connectors, for something like our REST request, you're going to have to understand a bit of that yourselves. So it's a slightly more onerous process. But of course, the trade-off here is that you're able to connect to practically any API out there. So with that being said, the first thing you always want to do when it comes to these types of efforts is to go ahead and approach the actual documentation for that particular API you're trying to consume. Now, I'm going to swap over to what is the Swagger UI documentation. What this is effectively the, let's call it the standard for the Swagger/OpenAPI definition. It is, of course, the company who actually built this definition, or should we rather say the company who's currently actively maintaining the definition. And so we'll use one of their published test endpoints to actually go ahead and consume this API. All right, let's head back to the canvas. Here, the first thing we're going to want to do is, of course, set up the REST request node. So there is a bit of setup that has to happen here. So we'll not concern ourselves with any of the connecting nodes or what else we'll be moving data from. For now, let's go ahead and just plug it in. We can go ahead and search for it under REST request. At this point, we're going to want to go and create a brand new connection for it. And then let's go ahead and edit that connection. From here, we'll notice that we can do a couple of things. The very important thing, first of all, is to go ahead and either provide an OpenAPI URL or an OpenAPI document. Both are, of course, supported. So if you only have that definition on a text file or something like it, you can plug it in. But for our purposes, the Swagger UI does expose that as a link that we can use. So let's go ahead and click on this, first of all. That's going to open up the OpenAPI definition, which you can see here is effectively a JSON payload. And we can go and copy the URL, which we just clicked on. And we're going to go ahead and plug it into our OpenAPI URL slot here. Let's rename this while we're at it. give this a save, and then we can actually go ahead all the way to the bottom and say refresh metadata. That's going to fetch that data from the URL and then attempt to interpret it as an OpenAPI definition. If you get this green block, then you are most likely good to go. At this point, we can just test this by heading back to the canvas, and we can actually click on our options and choose sample, just like how our branded connectors work. And here we can actually see a list of the endpoints that are now being exposed by that OpenAPI definition. We can go ahead and pick something over here. Let's get something like a simple get so that we can maybe provide or get some data without any parameters required. Now the node is configured to actually do the get inventory action, and we have a unique operation ID. And at this point, we could attempt to execute this, but it most likely won't work because we're not authenticated. So we need to head back to our Swagger UI. And that's going to then provide us with the detail on how this particular API is expected to authenticate. So as we click on authorize, we'll get an idea of what that looks like. And it's telling us that we have to provide a header called API key, and then of course a value. Now this would of course in the real world scenario be provided by the system that you're actually looking to integrate to. This is again just the test system. So let's copy this API key, head back to our REST request on the canvas. On our headers, we're going to go ahead and provide that API key as the header, and we can go ahead and actually just generate one within the documentation real quick. Let's copy this, test key, authorize. Fantastic, and go back to our canvas and provide that. Now we can close this off, and in theory, we can actually hook this up and execute this particular portion. Perfect. We have a functional node here, so we can actually take a look at the response, and we should be seeing some data coming through in our response here. Go ahead and close this off. We're also going to want to take a look at some of the other properties on the connection that will be very useful in terms of how you want this node to behave. So you can, for instance, provide a URL here in case the URL is not already provided by the OpenAPI definition, so you can actually go and specify that yourself. The auth type allows you to then pick between basic and bearer, so if something like basic or bearer was the type of authentication, which is very common, you could provide those in here without having to actually apply them to the canvas. It's of course significantly more secure. And then at the end of it all, we have things like return REST failure responses. The idea here is that should the node receive an error from the actual HTTPS request, it's not going to error entirely. It's going to provide that response in the payload, and then you can decide how to handle it. And then exclude empty query parameters is simply going to remove those query parameters from the actual URL if you're not providing data for them. This is, of course, only in the event that you have a parameter to provide. Let's go and plug another REST request onto the canvas to show you what that looks like. So we'll simply copy this one for the time being. Grab that and plug him back here. And then if we pick another request, one that will most likely need some kind of ID or something, we'll see that it provides that as a custom property here where you can then provide that query string parameter. So this will then not be provided if you provide that property as enabled. Perfect. Now that we have the node working, we can go ahead and business as usual, connect up the rest of the endpoints. We're just going to go ahead and build an Excel document out of the data we've extracted. Again, we're not focusing on the type of systems we're connecting here, more just how to use the REST request node. But as usual, let's go ahead and plug in the rest of the nodes, starting with our quick map. We will then want to go and plug in our Excel document. And so that we can easily expose that, let's go ahead and provide a variable bar where we're going to just provide that data to so we can download it easily. Let's go ahead and set up that custom prop so long, calling it file. It will of course be an output, and we can provide the type, the extension, and make sure that the Excel document is going to end up here. We'll generally be able to extrapolate the structure from the actual samples, but in this case, I'm just going to plug in a custom sample that I have for the kind of data we want to actually map to. Obviously, go ahead and hook up our response to that, and then finally our result to the table XML. And then configuring the actual Excel section of it would just be simply to create the document itself. Then we can head over to our mapping. As per usual, we'll simply drag the fields across that we want. So the amount of pets sold, the amount available on the market, and then maybe some pending sales as part of the data that we want to expose. We have our preview for the data that we're actually going to be sending to the Excel document. We don't really have to do any post-processing or any additional work on this, but don't forget that if you need to provide additional functionality here, so potentially further enrich or supplement that data, you can use our filter expressions to see a list of all the functions where you may want to perform calculations, do sum, count, look up if statements. Effectively anything you can think of from the Excel space, you can do that here. But as I said, we're happy with that. So let's close this off, hook up our execution flow, and then we can actually execute this from start to finish. We can take a look at our start node so that we can download that Excel file. And then let's simply go and open this up. And there's our data. Hopefully through this demo, you've got a better understanding of when you should be using the REST request connector, and of course how to use it and some of the supporting concepts around the REST request connector itself. Now, as always, have a look at our branded connectors, as we're more than likely going to have what you need, but don't forget that these generic connectors will provide you with a massive amount of flexibility in the space where you may be dealing with APIs that are potentially very obscure or not very popular. And again, for some reason, we haven't branded them yet. If you're interested in exploring some of the concepts and features that I've just shown you in more depth, you're welcome to head over to help.flowgear.net, where you'll find a list of comprehensive articles giving you more detail on some of the things that I've shown you today. On top of that, you're welcome to sign up for a free trial and explore Flowgear at your own pace. We do have a certification course available that'll take you through some of the foundational elements of Flowgear. And then finally, if you'd like, you're welcome to reach out to our team and inquire about a complimentary proof of concept where we can go ahead and show you some of what you're looking to achieve as part of the POC process.